Ready? Okay. Well, welcome. Good to see you all again. Glad your project is going well. I'm going to provide an overview of environmental policy. And the way I like to approach this subject is to think of environmental policy as really having sort of four big chunks to it. And as you can see, one is scope and methods, spatial, temporal, or in other words, time-dependent, and also normative dimensions. I know some of you have interest in the humanities, and as a social scientist, I too have a real interest in the ethical and normative dimensions of policy. And I think it's one of the things that distinguishes the policy realm of environmental issues from a pure science realm of environmental issues, as we're going to see. So we're going to talk about those dimensions. We're also going to talk about strategies. How do environmental policies, environmental decisions get made? And we're going to talk about some of the critical issues that affect environmental policies. I want to overview, in particular, benefits, costs, and risks. These are terms that you've been exposed to in previous lectures. But I want to kind of pull them together in terms of an overview of policy. And then finally, I want to end up in the second half of the period and time me so that we break right at the midpoint, because I'll go on.
I'll give you the nice one.
Yeah, great, excellent. I want to talk about some contemporary issues, and the phrase that I like using is actually a phrase that has been attributed, among others, to Jane Lubchenco, who's the current head of NOAA, which is grand challenges. And these are environmental problems like climate change, which I know you've already discussed in here, but there are other issues, water depletion, endangered species, in which we may be at tipping points where things that we do or fail to do will result in irreversible damage to the planet, to the environment. So let me start off with some spatial dimensions. This is basically a map derived from the European Space Agency back in the middle of the decade. And these are nitrogen oxide concentrations. The darker red and orange shades are high concentrations of nitrogen oxides in the atmosphere. And nitrogen oxides, as you know, are basically combustion products from fossil fuels. In particular, automobiles, factories, and power plants. I show you this map for a couple of reasons. One, to underscore that one of the characteristics of environmental policy is that we're dealing with problems and issues that do not respect political boundaries. And of course, in black outlines are the boundaries of various member states of the European Union. They do not respect those boundaries, which means they have to be, at some level, managed across those political boundaries. The second thing I think that's very important about this map is to emphasize that another spatial dimension of many environmental problems is that they are not evenly affecting everyone in every place. The higher concentrations, for those of you who are familiar with the geography of Europe, the higher concentrations of nitrogen oxides are in areas that both by virtue of topography, such as northern Italy, and also northern Europe, the Benelux countries, and the concentration of industry and transportation are most susceptible to the high concentrations of the problem. This is often the way environmental problems work, this spatial dimension. This is another set of maps. This one concentrates on an environmental phenomenon known as acid precipitation, which many of you have studied in other classes. These are two European maps generated by an organization that was created precisely to manage transboundary environmental problems, and it is called the Long Range Transboundary Air Pollution Body. And it was formed by countries in Europe and also North America, Canada and the US. And what they do is they monitor the transmission of particulates and other pollutants across national boundaries, in fact, literally across the Atlantic Ocean. These are impacts of acidity, and basically what we're really sensitive to are the areas in red and orange, which are areas in which the impacts of acid concentrations of precipitation are most acutely felt. Again, a problem that does not respect national boundaries has to be monitored and managed in a transboundary manner. So this is something I want to just kind of get you to think about as you think of environmental policies and environmental problems. And also, I do want to keep this informal. As you have questions or comments, just raise them. Just go ahead and chime right in. Okay, so the spatial dimensions of policy. These are two examples, and just to kind of review, that environmental problems transcend political boundaries. That also means they have to be managed conjointly by political boundaries at some level working together, whether within a nation state, like states in the United States, or communities within Southern California, counties, cities, or nations. Another thing that we're going to look at in more detail this afternoon is the fact that national governments almost universally are in charge of initiating major environmental policies through laws and regulations. However, in almost every instance, those policies end up being implemented, or in other words, put into place and enforced locally or subnationally. And the innovations in policy, you're seeing this in your research in Riverside and San Bernardino. Innovations can vary due to the information that local levels of governance have about a problem. Also, as a result of the resources that they have available to address the problem. And last but not least, as a result of the demands that are imposed upon them by their constituencies. And this is true in virtually every country in the world. This variation between the national formulation of policies and the local implementation. There is, in recent years, really about the last 10 or 15 years in particular, a global trend toward greater decentralization and what political scientists, people like myself, call devolution of authority for policies from the national governments to the localities. Again, national governments set the standards, but localities are being given increasing powers worldwide to weigh costs and benefits. Things like air pollution, we see this in California. Yes?
And does that help with the enforcement too, to have the localities be in charge?
Yeah, great question. It really does, because one of the things that national governments are not very good at is having the information needed to make good decisions on enforcement. The theory is if you're regulating something like water pollution or air quality or energy use, this is more efficiently and effectively done by local levels, assuming they have good guidelines in which to work, but it can be done much better because they're actually closer to the problem, can monitor it, can enforce it, can follow up. So yes, exactly right. And it's amazing. You say, well, how come we only discovered this 10 years ago or so? And one of the reasons we only discovered it that short a time ago, in part is because a lot of environmental policies didn't really even exist until the early 1970s worldwide. So there was this period almost of experimentation where out of the urgency of trying to address so many problems at once, national governments took on the load of trying to create policies. Over time, they began saying that these policies would work better. Once you've eliminated the gross problems of air pollution and water pollution, then the day-to-day management would work better if you could devolve them on localities. Some regionalized impacts. This is regionalized impacts projected for climate change. This is Australasia, Australia and New Zealand. And you can read this yourself and study it at your leisure, at your good time. But one of the things I like about this map is it underscores that this problem of transboundary and regional variation even affects things like climate change, where you say, well, everybody's affected by climate change. Well, that's true, but the resources that are affected and the way they're affected can vary tremendously, given not just the natural ecological factors that you've been learning about in other courses, including this, but because of social uses and variations in economic activities from region to region. One of the ones that really strikes me as significant is the Murray-Darling Basin in southeastern Australia, as is pointed out by that little box. This is a very, very serious set of issues revolving around drought and water shortages, which are affecting not just a large agricultural region of Australia, but has impacts on migratory birds and other resources, and also cities along the southeastern coast of Australia, which is where most of the country's population is, and who rely on their freshwater supplies from this river basin. I want to turn for a few moments to the temporal or the time-dependent aspects of public policy. These, again, are two maps, and I like using maps because I think one of the things that's really important about environmental policy is understanding how decisions have to be made in terms of the real world, real spatial areas and over periods of time. This is looking at acid precipitation, and it's limited to the United States, and two time periods, 1989 to 91, 2004 to 2006. And basically the areas, again in the darker red patterns, are areas in which there has been great exposure to acid precipitation. And so the question is, how much time do we have to act on a problem? How much progress or regress going the wrong direction can be measured over time, etc. And you read the maps and you can draw a couple of conclusions even if you're not a scientifically inclined person. You can say, well, the good news is the emissions of pollutants causing acid rain have clearly declined according to these two maps. And thus acid precipitation also has decreased. We also know from measurements that have been taken on the ground in these areas that are affected by this deposition that surface waters, particularly in the northeastern part of the country, are less acidic than they used to be in the late 80s and early 90s. And also regional haze, which is also caused by acid precipitation in places like the Great Smokies and Shenandoah and the Catskill Mountains in New York, has decreased, all to the good. However, and this is what we have to think about when we think about environmental policy, and I think many of you are groping with this as you deal with issues in the Inland Empire and environmental indicators. What about uncertainties in this data? And what about measurement problems in this information? This is a dimension of policy that we have to think about. We do know that acidic surface waters are still found in some areas, but some surface waters are showing signs of recovery. That's been monitored on the ground, and that's a good trend. However, very important, what the maps don't show you is just as important. National indicators are not available to track trends in other ways that acid rain has harmed the environment or human health, like, for example, lung disease, or the effect on private property, paint on homes, and things like that. So the consequences are uncertain, probably not very good, but clearly uncertain. And national indicators have not been developed to track visibility issues in cities or other populated areas. It's good that haze has decreased in parks, but what about in more urbanized areas? We just don't know because it's not being measured. This is something to think about when you develop environmental indicators, and why one has to be careful as a consumer of information if you're making policy. What do the data tell us? What don't the data tell us? And further, what don't the data know? Or what isn't known that can be measured? This is another example, and I want to go through a lot of these figures because these are things that you're constantly exposed to in your research and in your work, and sometimes we read these things and we kind of take for granted what they mean. This is the annual changes in wetland acreage in the United States. This has been collected by Dahl, who's a forester. This is going back to the early 1950s, and this is the net change in wetland in extent, or the extent of wetland acreage in acres per year. And basically you look at this and you can draw a couple of conclusions. One is that we continue to remove wetlands, but would you say not as rapid a pace as we have in the past? So that sounds pretty good, right? And in fact, in the period 1998 to 2004, if these figures are to be believed, we've actually increased wetland. How can that be? Anyone take a stab at that one? Well, under the Clean Water Act, developers actually do have to replace losses of wetlands so that there is no net loss within a particular region. That means if you fill in a wetland for farms or for a shopping mall, you have to find some suitable substitute area that can be restored as a wetland. There's a tremendous amount of debate over whether or not this is really an effective policy and whether or not you can really mimic the functions of a natural wetland. But nevertheless, it's taken place. Again, uncertainty and measurement, same issues, different context. Total wetland acreage has declined over the past 50 years, but the rate of loss has slowed. That seems like a good thing. However, different methods were used in the past to classify wetlands. What constituted a wetland in the past were actually not as, shall we say, as extensive or as liberal as is used today. We now realize that land areas that are wetlands are really more extensive than we used to think of in the past, which might mean what? That the problem is even worse than what's depicted on the data because we've changed our methods for measuring the extent of the problem. But at the very least, it's uncertain. Methods of characterization, what do wetlands do, how do they function, what are their social as well as ecological benefits, those things have all improved, but acreage data has been adjusted, resulting in changes in the overall wetland base and also reducing the accuracy of the trend that I showed you on that previous figure. Think of this, again, in your own research, environmental indicators. It's a classic problem of environmental policy. How reliable can we impugn into data that was generated in the past before we knew what we were really looking at and whether or not what we were looking at was a good measure of the problem? And then finally, I want to kind of lay these things together and look at a very, very contemporary environmental problem, and that is tropical storms. Separating the spatial and the temporal. Here we have two factors that are very important in the scope and methods of environmental policy. And this is data that's generated by NOAA. And these are tropical storms, mostly hurricanes, although not totally hurricanes, other tropical storms as well. And I just want to go through this with you and then talk about what a figure like this might tell us or how it can be interpreted, the things that we need to think about when we think like an environmental policy. From 1900, the early 1900s until the early part of this decade, we see three lines. Deaths from tropical storms, and the directionality has been what? Downward. That's good. However, property damages have done what? They've kind of vacillated until in about 1980, they really skyrocketed. Tremendous increase in property damage over time. And then you have this blue line, PDI, which is something that was invented by NOAA. It's called the Power Dissipation Index. Simply stated, it's a measure of a hurricane's energy. or intensity. I put that line next to these other two. Well, you tell me why I did that. What would we assume about the relationship between the strength of a hurricane and the damage and the death?
It would be proportional.
It would be proportional. The more powerful a storm, the more likely it is it's going to do tremendous damage, and it's going to lead to more loss of life. Why aren't these things proportional? Spatial and temporal. Well, where does a hurricane strike? Has a lot to do with the extent of damage and the loss of life. How much warning people have certainly has a lot to do with the loss of life. And anything else? Are there any non-natural factors that might account for this? What about a societal factor? What about people building more homes, more real estate development along coastal areas? In fact, when you look at this from the 1980s on, real estate policies, tax policies, development policies all correlate with the tremendous acceleration of property developments along the most vulnerable coastal areas in the United States, which, despite the fact that deaths until Katrina basically were on a downward slope from tropical storms, and even though, yes, there was some increase in the intensity of the storms, the rate of property damage relative to the intensity of the storms didn't match up. It was the human developments. So putting the spatial and the temporal together, and then adding a third factor, the behavioral, what people do and the choices we make, is very important. Questions about this? So this is something we have to think about when we think about the spatial and temporal dimensions of environmental policy. Does this make sense? Okay. I want to turn for a little while to the normative dimension or ethical dimension of policy. Unlike environmental science, questions of ethics and philosophy don't always have a clear empirical way of proof or an empirical method of proof. That does not mean, however, that they do not have some cognitive status that people can actually logically intuit or prove. In looking at the role of ethics, the normative dimension of public policy, one of the things that's interesting is that worldwide, and this has been true through much of modern history, we have tended to employ one of three basic approaches to evaluating or assessing the ethical dimensions of environmental policies. And those three methods, as you can see, are utilitarianism, which basically sort of asks the rhetorical question, should we seek to satisfy the needs of the greatest number of people? And the usual benchmark that's been employed by a utilitarian framework in environmental policy is, yes, we should, and we can measure that as at least roughly through things like economic growth and the efficient use of resources that benefits many. So we develop sustainable yields of timber, sustainable yields of farm products. We enhance water resources by damming rivers for power and navigation and public supply and so forth. Utilitarianism is one approach. It's not the only approach. The other two approaches, which are very important, are important, as we'll see momentarily, because they actually have a practical consequence. One is the categorical imperative or golden rule, which says, well, yes, you can worry about the greatest good for the greatest number, but what if you happen to be one of those that isn't benefiting from being part of that greatest number of a policy? Should we aim instead perhaps to treat others as we would wish to be treated? Should anyone be exposed to an environmental risk? Even if the benefits of imposing that risk on a few are outweighed by the fact that society benefits. These are questions that are raised in particular when we talk about managing the environment fairly, keeping promises and commitments. It's not right that the Inland Empire continues to want more and more water from the Colorado River. That's not really providing the greatest good for the greatest number in the rest of California. Yes, but those people in the Inland Empire were promised that if they agreed to settle in that area, the government would provide certain resources for them. That was a commitment made as a condition of settlement. Maybe that also has a place. You can see how these debates get going in different directions. Also, a categorical imperative asks that we put ourselves in another person's place. Would we accept a policy if we were subject to it? A little later on, we'll talk about climate change. China and India, gosh, they need to stop their combustion of fossil fuels. Don't they know that they're accelerating and exacerbating the problem of climate change? Well, put ourselves in their place. They might be saying, well, the developed, highly industrialized countries of the world had their run for 100 years. They were developing fossil fuel industries. Now they've got their wealth, and now what they're trying to do is say we shouldn't try to have ours. Is that fair? So you see there are different ways of norming this out, and these are ways of explaining the policy debate. And then thirdly and finally, a very important approach to the normative dimension of policy is one that's called stewardship. And stewardship is a very creative approach that says, all this stuff about benefits and costs and people putting themselves in other people's place, it sounds great, sounds wonderful, but who speaks for the trees? Who speaks for the fish? Who speaks for future generations? They don't vote. And yet so many of our environmental problems are going to affect people that aren't even here. And if we only thought in terms of a categorical imperative or a utilitarian premise, we might not have national parks because our ancestors might have said, the heck with the future. I don't care. We just need to develop that land. So stewardship says we should aim to care for those who can't care for themselves. And there are somewhat divergent approaches that have been taken by ethical philosophers and policy analysts toward this question. There are many, but I think two are particularly outstanding. One is the notion that as rational creatures with the ability to cognize our way through problems, it is in our self-interest to care for other life forms. It's in our self-interest to protect endangered species, because if those species disappear, that will lead to putting ourselves in jeopardy. There is another view, which has been extant throughout history and in almost every culture, and has filtered its way into almost every environmental policy. And that is a spiritual view that says, well, if humans are made in the image of a deity, then we're obliged to care for all of creation. That it's not just a right, it's a duty, it's an obligation. So we'll see some examples of that. Questions about this? So this is a normative dimension, very important. I want to actually use some practical examples of this. It's easy to sort of say, oh yeah, there's these lofty ideals about environmental policy, but does anybody really pay any attention to that? How many of you have seen Hoover Dam? Right? Yeah. Franklin Roosevelt, 1935, when Hoover Dam opened, gave this beautiful little speech. And I love it because basically it is utilitarianism. He probably didn't sit down and say, I'm going to write a utilitarian doctrine. But in fact, what he was doing was tapping into the public mood about environmental policy in the heart of the Great Depression, which is we need jobs, we need economic benefits, we need to harness rivers, and in fact, an unregulated river adds little value to the region this dam serves. Could you imagine someone saying that in 2010? We've got to dam the American River, Northern California, because it serves no useful purpose, being unregulated. See the difference? This is a utilitarian notion of environmental policy, and it was a very popular notion in its time. This was the unregulated river that Roosevelt was talking about, what it looked like 2 years before construction of the dam began in 1928, and the same spot 7 years later when the dam was completed. So you judge for yourself. Well, certainly different. What about stewardship? Can we point to any practical policy examples in which this actually plays out, in which people say we have an obligation to care for those that cannot care for themselves? Well, the Endangered Species Act. This is a quote from the preamble of that act, as written by Congress in 1973, and it's highly ethically charged. It's saying that we have so depleted certain species in numbers and in diversity that are of great intrinsic value along several dimensions, that we now must use all methods and procedures to bring them back to the point where they will not be further threatened. It's our obligation to care for species that cannot care for themselves. This was quite a revolutionary way of looking at environmental policy. And the thing that is fascinating to me is that this is only 40 years removed from the previous policy as enunciated by Franklin Roosevelt at the opening of Hoover Dam. So these are just some examples to give you a sense of the contrasts that can be generated when we talk about the dimensions of policy. And then I won't spend a lot of time talking about these, but I like using these because as somebody that studies environmental philosophy, I find it compellingly interesting that worldwide a number of faiths and a number of civilizations, and these are all quotes that have to do something about water, which has a sort of a primal environmental role, as we know. These are from various religious faiths, and they all seem to be talking about many of the same things. There are themes of sustainability. There are themes of the obligation to take care of something that has been given to us in perpetuity. And they all really have policy implications. I mean, in fact, when you look at the civilizations in which these doctrines developed, there's been a constant clamor to think about the need to have environmentally protective policies, in part based on these doctrines. I particularly like this, the two quotes from the Old Testament, Ezekiel and Genesis, because I think they're very contrasting and also open themselves up to, as we know, multiple interpretations historically. The one from Ezekiel suggests that we ought to protect water and we ought to protect species and we ought to be very much of a steward in a traditional sense. The second one from Genesis, some people say, well, what was really intended was that we use up all these resources. I mean, after all, we were put in charge, darn it. Everything is supposed to be subject to us. That word dominion has scared some people over time. So at any rate, so I just put this out there so you get the sense that in looking at environmental policy, we can't just look at the political realm. We also have to look at this realm of normative ethics, philosophies, and faiths. Questions about this? Anything striking about these? This notion of stewardship and really guiding behavior, individual actions, norms. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just curious, I look primarily at businesses. Do companies ever try and incorporate this into their policy?
That's a great question. Do they try to? And the answer is yes, they do. And oftentimes you'll see this in codes of conduct in corporations. In fact, In recent years, one of the things that's really interesting is that in developing these codes of, say, stewardship toward the environment, you see this in a lot of advertising. I noticed it recently, for example, several issues recently in Smithsonian and National Geographic, companies like Ford, Toyota, General Electric, where it's not just about, hey, we're doing good things for the environment, but it's phrased in the terms of, we have benefited from these resources in what we do. And we want the ultimate user of our products to understand the need to, A, protect those resources from further harm, and B, that we as a company have an obligation to be good stewards toward this by creating less polluting vehicles, pushing for more recycling, conserving resources, using less materials. The U.S. Green Building Council, LEED certification, a lot of that ethic is really very much embedded in it. And in looking at the way those codes of environmental conduct have developed, what's interesting is that they do use much of this kind of language. And especially you see this in other countries where these companies operate. They take great pains to tailor that message. Now, you know, some say, well, that's marketing. Well, yeah, it is marketing. But it's also communicating your message in an appropriate way so that the audience you're speaking to understands it. So yeah, you absolutely do see this. You absolutely do. Other questions? I think we're going to see more of it over time. And I think we're going to see it for the reason I alluded to a little while ago when I showed you the difference between utilitarianism and stewardship, as shown in the Endangered Species Act, because public values are changing. You know, at one time, when we, you know, as consumers and as voters and as citizens didn't really care about these issues, it was not good form to try to push these things. Now that the underlying values are changing worldwide, we're going to see corporations doing, I think, more of this. Stewardship. So we have philosophy, we have law. How about real life actions? I teach an undergraduate course on water resources policy, and many of my students who come from Southern California are surprised to know that there actually is a river in Los Angeles. And you can hardly blame them because you wouldn't know it if you simply went down to the First Street Bridge or near Boyle Heights and you looked at this big concrete culvert. But in 1900, near Griffith Park, the Los Angeles River was a real river. As a matter of fact, until 1913, it was the primary source of water supply for Los Angeles until the Owens Valley Aqueduct was completed. And you can see both the main stem of the river and the Arroyo Seco, major tributary, have been victims of flooding at various periods, somewhat violent flooding. Why do I show you these pictures? Well, to contrast it with these pictures, which is what the Los Angeles River looks like today, and you know, the Glendale area, and then in downtown LA, and it is, as you know and have seen, a concrete floodway, culvert. There is an organization called the Friends of the Los Angeles River, which is an NGO that wants to take this and do something that would restore it to this, but without the externalities of the tremendous flooding that went on in the past. And a rhetorical question, is this stewardship? Well, interestingly enough, at one time it was considered stewardship, because what we were doing is we were taking a wild river that was not harnessable, and we were controlling it for the benefit of future generations and for society. But those values change. These are actually, the picture at the top is a real picture of a portion of the Los Angeles River, and then below them are two computer-generated images. These were produced by something called the Los Angeles River Revitalization Master Plan, which is an effort that was organized about 10 years ago to do the following things: to remove channelization along a segment of the Los Angeles River to replant vegetation and develop greenways and parks, and to achieve a variety of public goals, policy goals, flood abatement, water quality, celebrate the cultural heritage of the river, the notion that a waterfront is actually an amenity, not a nuisance, and to foster civic pride. And these are views showing different stages of a anticipated or proposed restoration of the river that would in fact restore it to something like a riparian corridor over time. And the goal of this is to achieve stewardship philosophically in light of the changes of public attitudes. Now I show you this for another reason, and that is to note that our attitudes toward environmental resources, including water, change over time. At one time when cities first developed, and this is true in every civilization, we looked at rivers as things to be exploited, to be used for water supply, for farms, for orchards, for factories, for public supply. Later we saw them as something to be harnessed because they were a nuisance to development. Now we see them as an amenity. And this is a characteristic of a post-industrial society. And this is what's going on. And I think it clearly exemplifies the principle of stewardship. Maybe with a little bit of utilitarianism mixed in. That now we're ready, the greatest good for the greatest number of Angelinos would be a river that actually attracts people to visit. Haven't said anything about categorical imperatives, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Don't put them under risks that you wouldn't agree to put yourself under. Don't burden them with things you wouldn't think of accepting yourself. How many of you are familiar with this? The waste isolation pilot plant. This is near Carlsbad, New Mexico. What is this? Well, this is a salt mine, or what used to be a salt mine, about 1,200 feet under the surface of this building on the right. And the U.S. Department of Energy is using this salt cavern to store this material, which is being trucked in welded stainless steel canisters from defense installations around the United States. Places like Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where I used to work, Los Alamos, New Mexico, Hanford, Washington, Rocky Flats, Colorado, where high-level radioactive waste in the manufacture of nuclear weapons has been stored, well, for about 70 years. And now we're trying to give it a permanent home away from the public, away from you and I. And what the Department of Energy has concluded, and what Congress managed to be convinced in, is that this waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico is probably the best geologic place for it. If it's salt, that means it's dry. And it also means that it's probably been dry for tens of thousands of years and is likely, probabilistically, to remain dry for tens of thousands more, which is good because this stuff will remain radioactive for tens of thousands of years. So the idea is to literally isolate it from the biosphere, from the environment, from human risk. What do you think? This is a good idea? Well, here's an interesting question. Would we accept this policy if we didn't know which generation we were going to be born into? Let me tell you a story about this project. This is actually from the U.S. Department of Energy's website. I said a few moments ago that this material is going to remain a hazard for tens of thousands of years. Are there any institutions that you know of that have endured for tens of thousands of years? Any government? Any religion? any organized institution of any sort? Would you be willing to bet that 10,000 or 20,000 years from now people will speak English? Are you willing to bet on anything about 10 or 20,000 years from now? Well, what if somebody would come across this waste isolation pilot plant, which will presumably be closed, shut, buried, stuffed with cement, sealed off? What if somebody should stumble upon it and say, oh, this looks like an interesting place for an archaeological dig. Let's find out what those people back in the 21st century were doing. How do you avert that? How do you prevent that? This is a categorical imperative problem. And what the Department of Energy has come up with is something called passive controls, which means trying to develop a system of warnings that presumably could be universally understandable by any culture and any civilization. And they've hired cultural anthropologists, geographers, political scientists. One time I was involved in one of the panels that looked at this problem and what to come up with. Permanent markers, long-term records, and other measures as awareness triggers. The idea here is to put ourselves in the position of people in the future and trying to predict what it is that they would need before we could feel comfortable in adopting this decision. Now, do you feel better? These are the kinds of challenges that we face in environmental policy, and it's very much an ethical challenge. Okay. Let's turn to strategies for a bit, how decisions get made. And political scientists look at the policy-making process for the environment as really having four distinct phases to them. The first is what we call agenda setting, which means you get the attention of policymakers. You get them interested in why a certain problem should be addressed. This is what actually you're doing in the Inland Empire, in a sense, is agenda setting. You're trying to get the attention of people in political positions to say, we have a set of tools that we're developing that's going to be very important and that can be used to change policy. After you get the attention of policymakers, you get on their agenda, literally, thus agenda setting, is you formulate policies, which means you choose alternatives to address these issues. And then you implement those policies, and implementation is different from formulation in that you're actually putting into place a remedy. Clean Air Act sets a standard for air quality. Clean Water Act sets a standard for pollutants in water. The implementation are regulations which then say, how do you achieve those levels of compliance? Through what tools, through what devices? And then, and this is a very important thing in public policy, environmental policy, is there is a need to assess the results and the impacts of what you've done, both because society wants to know how effectively these decisions have managed the problem, and presumably so you can feed back into improving, amending, modifying, changing the policy, and making it work better in the future. I want to talk a little bit about agenda setting, since it's one of the most controversial areas of environmental policy, and I think somewhat probably one of the more mysterious areas, because we're not actually always certain how environmental policies get the attention. You know, why is it that we've decided to deal with certain issues? And political scientists who've studied this issue have said that there basically are sort of four big ways that things get on the agenda. Sometimes a combination of these four factors is employed. One is a crisis. Some of you might remember Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, which was an indictment of pesticides, DDT. Some of you may have read it in high school. I remember when I first read this book, it was really a shock. And at that time, we were just starting to establish federal policies in the United States and in other countries regulating pesticide use and its impacts on the environment. More currently, Al Gore's movie An Inconvenient Truth, which some would say sort of gave voice to climate as being a big issue. Before Silent Spring was written, DDT was a problem. Before Inconvenient Truth came out as a movie, climate change was an issue. But it brought a sense of crisis to the public's attention and dramatized an issue. Crisis is important. It's not the only way, however, that you can get changes in public policy in the environment. Sometimes, in fact, I would argue more commonly, what we see are gradual changes that are brought about by a slow, incremental understanding of what we're doing to the environment and what those changes to the environment are doing to us. And one of the best examples of that is air pollution. Air pollution policies in the United States and in Europe, which is where these policies were first introduced in the 1950s, really came about through gradual studies by scientists into smog and the emergent, and they were just that, they were only beginning to be dimly understood, emergent health effects of things like ozone, discerning its causes and its means of prevention. The same with pesticides. Yes, Silent Spring gave dramatic crisis attention to the issue, but it also took gradual awareness of the discovery of the impacts of DDT and other pesticides in the environment. Eventually, what that did is that changed public attitudes. What's very interesting, and you can, some of you, I showed in my environmental policy class a while back, a National Geographic magazine from the year I was born. And it was a picture in this magazine of the city that I happened to be born into. That's Cleveland, Ohio. And it was a picture of Cleveland, and you couldn't see the city. It was just soot. It was black. It was darkness in the middle of the day. Now, if that picture were put in a National Geographic magazine today, they would probably say horrible, environmentally tragic consequences of living in Cleveland. But instead, the year I was born, it said something to the effect of, Cleveland is a great driver of America's economy, and look at this robust. Okay, you get the picture. Gradual change in public attitudes. If the public doesn't see things as a problem, you can't get too far ahead of them and try to introduce a policy change in the environment. And in the early 1950s, we weren't ready to look at those things as problems. We looked at them as benefits. Pollution meant prosperity. That's the smell of money. Now we know better. So you have events, crisis and gradual change in public attitudes. You also have constraints that are imposed by what we call the political stream and the policy stream. And let me just say a couple things about that. The political stream is constraints imposed by the political process. Things like the election cycle and the power of organized interest groups. Resources available to solve problems. The sharing of responsibility with other governments. We see this today in the United States in terms of understanding things like climate change. Some of you may have heard on NPR this morning. I was listening to it on my way getting myself together this morning. The cap and trade issue is suddenly this huge political issue. It's become sort of a measure of whether or not you're in favor of more government intervention in the economy or less government intervention in the economy. Well, be that as it may, that says something about the influence of election cycles on environmental policies. It also says something about the power of organized interests, which often wax and wane in light of those interests. The policy stream, very interesting. By policy stream, we mean the nature of the problem, not just the nature of the process. Sometimes an issue is not amenable to centralized regulation from Washington. Non-point pollution of water is something that really can't be governed very well by Washington. And in fact, the Clean Water Act does not regulate runoff pollution. Runoff pollution is managed by land use controls, farming, impervious surface, urbanization, rules that are developed, going back to what we talked about earlier this afternoon, at the local levels of government. And of course, knowledge. Do we have enough information to recommend policies? This is a question that's often been raised in terms of climate change. Do we have the information we need to actually prescribe a solution? And do the public and experts agree on what's important? For example, toxic substances and oil spills. It's very interesting. There have been a number of studies in recent years that have suggested that one of the great impediments to dramatically changing environmental policy is the fact that problems which scientists believe are the major problems and problems which the public believes are major environmental problems are very divergent. Oil spills are definitely seen by the public as an urgent environmental concern. Yet consistently in most rankings by scientists generally don't rank oil spills as severe, for example, as things like climate change and endangered species. Why? Because those are catastrophes that are seen as manageable and recoverable. Now, whether or not we're going to continue to see those things in that light, not sure. But this has been the case, at least until recently. So it's kind of a system of trying to change opinion, trying to lead opinion, trying not to get too far ahead of it, trying not to get too far behind it. It's very much of a juggling act. Questions about this? So agenda setting. I think a lot of environmental policies are really combinations of this. About ready for a break?
Yeah, I think it's good.
So this is something we'll come back to. So let's go ahead and take a break. Okay.
Can I ask a
Sure.
question about that last part?
Absolutely.
How much of those, or of the bottom three, the factors, how much of that do you think is influenced by the economy?
That's a great question. I think all three of them are directly or indirectly influenced by the economy. And here's why I say that. And I'm going to add the political stream factors too, but let's start with the three factors that you alluded to. While there may be some empirical reason to say some things are amenable to centralized control, some things need to be left to more local levels, I believe that the state of the economy influences our perception of those issues very profoundly. For example, if you have an issue, let's say, well, back up a step, you have a condition where the economy is not doing well and concern with jobs and economic growth are paramount in the public's mind as opposed to an environmental problem, then they're going to view centralized efforts at addressing those problems as having more costs and burdens than they will see them as having benefits. On the other hand, if a problem arises where the problem is seen as such a crisis that it affects so many people, then that might trump the perception of the costs or the burdens that will be. Superfund was a good example of this. Way back in the 1980s, when we started discovering that homes were actually being built over toxic waste sites, it was such a sobering shock to so many Americans that the idea of setting up a fund, $1 billion trust fund to clean up these sites, nobody batted an eyelash. Well, of course we have to do that. Today, in a more constrained condition, we wouldn't think so. So I actually think all of these. Even the bottom one. Do public and experts agree on what's important? Well, sometimes importance is a question of the lens through which you view that importance, and do you view it through the lens of the economy? And knowledge. I think there is something to be said for the risk-based assumptions of knowledge, that if, I participated in a study for NOAA on the use of climate change information by water managers. This was last year. This was a 3-year project. And one of the things we found is the concept of uncertainty is interpreted very differently by policymakers and scientists. When you say to a scientist, well, we're uncertain, but here's what we think we know, that's being a credible scientist, right? We all know this. But to a policymaker or to someone in business, if you say, well, we're really not very certain, they say, well, then you don't really have enough information to make that decision. You need to be more cautious because you're going to be committing tremendous amounts of resources for long periods of time. Is one right and the other wrong? No, it's really a question of somehow finding a way to blend those perspectives. And then to push that a little bit, election cycles, as we know, are influenced by the state of the economy. Ipso facto, so are policy outcomes, as are the resources available to solve the problems. So you can go on and on and on and on. What's interesting to me about the Gulf oil disaster this summer as a crisis is that it was one of those disasters that had environmental impacts, which were pretty palpable, but also clear economic impacts, which is why there was so much pressure to act quickly, because you had this rare convergence of factors. Does that help?
Mm-hmm.
Let me turn to the issue of policy implementation, putting rules into effect. Okay, so policy making. Congress passes a law. The state legislature passes a law. What happens to it? Well, there are different strategies of compliance, and this is something that we have found worldwide tends to be true in policy implementation. And here's where we really get into the rubber meeting the road. On the one hand, there is regulation, which is what we usually think of when we think of government acting in a policy capacity to address the environment. We think of rules supported by sanctions, or in other words, punishments, to limit discretion. Think about this. There are many things that could be regulated, and the choice of what you regulate is very crucial in the design of environmental policy. You can regulate emissions into the air, into the water, onto the soil. You can also regulate inputs, which is a more intrusive form of regulation. Rather than regulating what comes out of a process, you're regulating what goes into it, the kind of fuel you can use in a car, the sulfur content of coal. These all have different impacts on different facets of the economy. You can also regulate technologies, which is more intrusive still. And economists, by the way, often charge that these have diminishing returns. Because when you regulate emissions, then you leave it to the emitter or the polluter to decide how best to handle the problem. You set a standard, they come up with the innovation. If you regulate the technology, you're actually choosing winners and losers. You're saying pollution in cars can only be solved by catalytic converters or by using non-leaded fuels, rather than allowing innovations to flourish that will meet your standard. Which gets us to market-based tools, as we'll talk about in just a moment. You can also regulate operations, licenses, and certifications, power plants, vehicle inspections here in California. You're actually regulating the operation of a motor vehicle to see if it complies with the Clean Air Act. So regulation is one strategy of compliance. Increasingly, and this is true worldwide, and I think it's also been more true in the last decade or so, is a great deal of emphasis being placed on market-based tools, monetary incentives, whether through tradable permits, in which you get a bonus for over-complying. The Clean Air Act in the United States actually works through tradable permits for sulfur dioxide. Utilities that can over-comply with the Clean Air Act standards on sulfur dioxide can then sell their rights to emit to a utility or to an industry that cannot comply. They get two benefits. One is the environment is improving, and they're making money by over-complying. Also, tax credits. The European Union, the European community has, I think, gone much, much further than we have in the United States on this. Fees, a fee system that's basically based on using the tax credit system to encourage less pollution. In France and in Germany, if you pollute less, particularly in water pollution, you actually pay lower taxes. The theory is that if you're doing less pollution and you're creating less damage to the environment, then it's costing the public less to clean up that damage, and so you should in effect be rebated through your taxes. Conservation tax rebates is what these are called in many European Union countries. So this is and we're going to talk more about the advantages and disadvantages of these tools in a moment. Third are what we call voluntary partnership approaches. This is something that's also being used in a lot of countries, including the United States. These usually take place through negotiation between the private sector and the government. You actually negotiate your best deal for how to improve the environment. The Environmental Protection Agency has concluded a series of what are called performance partnership agreements with states throughout the United States to try to reach agreement on the best way to achieve improvements in air quality. California and the United States government have done this for air pollution, and it's actually worked. Because what the state of California has said is, look, we fully intend to meet the conditions of the Clean Air Act, but the right regulations to do this really should be left to us, because we know what the problem is and how it varies from among region in the state. And through a variety of tools, we can actually negotiate and reach a better way of achieving these objectives. Pollution prevention programs, in which industries pursue recycling programs, voluntarily do this. For example, the computer industry, recycling computer terminals. The copy machine industry and the computer printer industry, voluntarily recycling printer cartridges. That is a kind of pollution prevention program, which actually is a partnership agreement with the government, in which, as a result of agreeing with your corporate neighbors to do something that will benefit the environment, the government desists from imposing an additional set of regulatory burdens on you. Does that work, by the way? Works pretty well. Works pretty well because it's voluntary compliance and because the industry knows itself better than anyone else. And it actually saves money, because then you take all of these things that would otherwise be discarded in landfills and contribute to the toxic waste stream and actually reuse them. The Department of Energy has something like a voluntary partnership approach in the cleanup of its contaminated sites. It has agreements with states called Federal Facility Compliance Agreements, which are efforts to do the same thing. These are common tools. Let me talk just a bit about an uncommon tool, and that is education and information. In the last decade or so, there has been a huge movement afoot in the environmental policy community to use education and information to the public about impacts and risks as a way of achieving a kind of self-compliance with environmental objectives. Some of you have seen many examples of this in your daily life. Ozone alerts. On TV it said this particular bad conditions for ozone: don't mow your lawn, don't drive your car, take the natural gas-fired bus if you can and if you don't need to get somewhere in a hurry. Okay, these are ways of voluntarily using education and information as a way of making choices. Drain to stream signs. Here in Southern California they say drain to ocean. Don't put your motor oil down there. These are ways of educating the public. Recycling. You see on your water bill from the Irvine Ranch Water District that last month you did really well. You stayed within your conservation rate, so you're only going to pay so many cents per acre foot of water. If you exceed that, then you're going to pay more for each unit of water. Education and information. If you provide information to the public about impacts and risks and alternatives, then you can actually change behavior. So this is a means of policy. Does it work in everything? No, but it works in a lot of things. Significance of this. One of the things that we've learned in the past 40 years is that there's kind of been an evolution in environmental policy. We really started with regulation. When the environmental movement started in the 1970s, the whole world only knew top-down regulation, imposing rules with sanctions. Over time, we began to see that those regulations had diminishing returns and benefits and increasing costs in governance, upon the public, upon businesses. And they were also seen as too blunt an instrument, right? They solved big problems, but they didn't really deal with the more micro problems that we deal with every day. So gradually, we moved to market-based tools, voluntary partnerships, and now the most innovative, I think, education and information. I think that says something about the relationship between knowledge and experience and environmental policy. I want to say a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of these various tools. There's a huge body of research that's been done by political scientists, by economists, by many others about these various criteria, these various strategies. And basically looking at three things. One is the overall flexibility of these tools. Are these tools flexible? Can they be adjusted to various conditions? Are they clear and transparent? Can people understand what they're demanding? And overall, can they be, remember that word evaluation? Can they be assessed? You know, how do we know that people are doing certain things because there's a law that says you have to do them? And you can see for yourself, regulation tends to be inflexible, a lack of discretion for either the policymaker or the effective audience. Market incentives, on the other hand, are highly flexible. Voluntary partnerships are also highly flexible, as is education and information. On the other hand, the one thing you can say about regulation is it's very clear. If you don't do X, you're going to jail, or you're going to pay a big fine, or we're going to take your license away from you. Market incentives aren't always very clear or transparent. For example, where do you set a charge or a fee? And how do you assess compliance and measure progress? What tax or fee will actually deter people's behavior? You know, we talk about a carbon tax. What should it be? Where should it be set? How high does it need to be before we really stop driving? These are questions that are not very easy to answer, and a lot of them are going to be sort of touch and go. Voluntary partnerships are very unclear. Education, here's one that we know from our experience, can be clear or unclear depending on how carefully the message is crafted. You know, we're into this debate right now with cigarette packaging, right? You know, how explicit does the message have to be before people get the idea that smoking is bad? And finally, can you evaluate these things? Well, you can evaluate regulation. You can at least regulate compliance. The EPA does this all the time. Can you actually evaluate effectiveness? We have all these Clean Air Act regulations, Clean Water Act regulations. Most industries are complying with them. But is water quality actually improving in the United States? What do you think about that? In some ways it has been, in other ways it isn't. Because there's more of us, there's more land uses that are creating more nuisances to the environment. Market incentives are difficult to evaluate. It's especially difficult to evaluate compliance and effectiveness due to what we call pecuniary effects, which means that sometimes, give you an example, you raise the cost of doing business on a chemical industry to such an extent that what they end up doing is they close their toxic manufacturing industries and do what? Move them to India. Are you solving the problem or moving it somewhere else? You've heard the expression race to the bottom. This is one of the things that's happening worldwide with the economy and the environment. And so on and so forth. So these are some things to think about when we think about these questions of implementation. Let me turn for a moment to evaluation. You've all thought about this. You're probably starting to think about it in your work in the Inland Empire. When you talk about evaluating policy, what do you mean? What do you mean evaluating? What values are you trying to achieve? Now, people who have studied environmental policy would argue that there are at least these 5 criteria that are commonly employed in evaluating environmental policy. We often evaluate policy on efficiency grounds. How much does it cost? What are its benefits? But we can also be very concerned, as we'll see momentarily with a very specific example, on equity. Who pays? Are the burdens fairly distributed? Are the benefits fairly allocated? Is the policy humane? Does it mistreat people or animals? That's a very important environmental policy concern. As we saw with the Endangered Species Act, you don't put a cost on it. The Endangered Species Act doesn't say, we'll only preserve these other species if it doesn't cost very much. Right? There is no cost criterion. Feasible. I know exactly how to solve the problem of air pollution in Southern California. We're just going to make everybody give up their big cars. Well, that's great. But is that practical? Or would the social, economic, and cultural disruption be so severe that it just wouldn't be practicable? Right? And will the public accept the remedy? Cap and trade. Land use restrictions to prevent water pollution.
Second question.
Shoot, Alexis.
Last time when Linda Cohen was here, we talked about the Clean Air Act and why it was so successful, and I was wondering, do you think because the way it was designed and maybe the environment that it's created in was the reason it's been so successful, or what characteristics do you think?
That's a great question. I think it's a little bit of both. I think one of the things that the Clean Air Act had going for it is that the science of reducing air pollution was relatively straightforward. Now, the particular tool that you would use to achieve those objectives, not so, which is why we've used market emissions trading, which is a very smart way of now doing it with sulfur dioxide. But the basic science of air pollution, what causes air pollution, how can we change the standards for emissions, for fuels that are combusted and so forth, were fairly straightforward. So, and we actually had about 25 years of experience before that act was even passed, in which scientists and engineers had studied everything that could possibly be learned about combustion and how it creates air pollution. So we had a lot of experience with that. So I think yes, I think it has been very successful in part for those reasons. I think secondly, and I began to allude to this, the Clean Air Act was crafted very smartly. It basically said these are the standards for criteria pollutants. And we'll revisit those criteria pollutants as we learn more public health, more epidemiological. In fact, that was left open in the original act. Congress shall reserve the right to. Okay, so we came back and we said, no, we got to, ratchet down particulates. We got to ratchet down air toxics because we're now learning that they have more long-term latent effects, right? So it was very smartly crafted. It was also smartly crafted in that it allowed these various tools to be employed. Regulation was what we did initially because that's what we knew best. Later, when we found that we were actually contributing to worsening the problem in some respects by forcing power plants to build higher and higher stacks to keep the ambient air quality levels good at ground level, we're actually pumping pollutants into the upper atmosphere and transporting them long distances. Then we got smart again and we started using market incentives and voluntary partnerships to try to adjust for that. So yes. And we don't have that with water. It's much more complex because, as I've argued in my own research, we don't really have a water pollution problem in the United States or in Europe or in most countries. What we have is a land use problem. It's the land uses that are causing water pollution. And we don't have a national land use act. Okay? An evaluation challenge. You've all heard the phrase environmental justice. You all know something about environmental justice. But environmental justice to me is a fascinating case study to look at the problem of evaluating policy outcomes. Just by way of review, here's the basic argument. You've seen it, you've heard it, you've read about it, that the poor and minorities bear a disproportionate burden of environmental risks. Environmental sexism, women working in particularly hazardous industries, right? Like textiles in the South for decades, like radium dial painters at the turn of the 20th century. Racism, environmental racism. Poor peoples of color living close to toxic and hazardous waste locations. Economic chauvinism, those who can move further from nuisances, those who can't get stuck with having to endure the nuisances, and the uneven distribution of benefits. If you live in Irvine, you have lots of neighborhood parks. If you live in Carson, you don't have any. Okay? Challenges. What's at fault? Is it the way we make environmental decisions? Is it the process? Or is it the outcomes? Are we deliberately seeking to burden the less well-off? Or is it that economics force the less well-off to reside and work in hazardous settings? Maybe it's both. If it's a process or a decisional problem, then the solution lies in empowering the less well-off to participate in decisions that affect their health, welfare, and well-being. This, by the way, has been the official position of EPA since the Clinton administration, that it is not just an outcomes problem, it is a process problem. Industries, public officials know that the poor and minorities do not have the political resources to fight environmental nuisances. And that's why we put waste incinerators and toxic waste sites in those places. That's why we sell Indian tribes on housing toxic waste dumps as a means of accumulating income, because we know they don't have much of a choice economically. So, disparities vary. Race and residential and workplace hazards, indigenous peoples and environmental and health problems, gender and workplace hazards, reproductive hazards. And there is also a jobs and environment conundrum. Many times when you ask the poor living in the inner city how they feel about a new industry locating in that community that may pose some environmental risks, they say, well, really could use the jobs, really could use the income. So it's a conundrum. That's what we mean. This is a figure that was generated based on EPA data by an organization called scorecard.org, which is a community-based environmental group that monitors environmental justice. And you can read it for yourself. This is the distribution of risks by race, ethnicity, and income in California. Lifetime cancer risks from air pollutants. You have a key here on the right. And you have on this time series figure, income, cancer risk per million, on the y-axis. How do you interpret this? What would you say about the evaluation of environmental justice? Is there a case to be made here? Are certain people more subject to environmental risk than others? Seems so, doesn't it? If the data are to be believed, Native Americans suffer the least, but that's probably because their exposure to hazardous air pollutants is less likely simply because they live in rural areas more than cities. On the other hand, African Americans definitely have a high risk, followed by Latinos and Asian Americans. And whites have a fairly low risk, relatively speaking. And the risk tends to track downward, and especially dramatically for African Americans. What that would seem to say is that it kind of comes back to the thing we talked about earlier about the spatial and temporal dimension of policy. African Americans are likely to live closest to toxic hazards. They're also likely to have lower incomes, and so the risk is likely to be higher. But when you actually look at the lifetime risks, it's quite a bit higher, quite a bit higher. So this would be one way of evaluating in the efficacy of environmental justice. And you can actually see this kind of data carried out in other categories. Questions about this? So again, using information as a way of policy evaluation. So let me turn finally to this issue of grand challenges I promised at the beginning. I know you've talked about climate change in here, and you're going to continue to, and I'm not going to talk a lot about climate. I want to talk about some other grand challenges, but I am going to allude to climate change because what we mean by grand challenges, and again, Jane Lubchenco, who's now the head of NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, we mean a high consequence problem, a problem that if it occurs is going to have very, very great consequences. But uncertain probability. We just don't know. And of course, what we don't know can hurt us. As measured in three ways. By the impacts being both dramatic and possibly irreversible. Sea level rise, desertification, groundwater depletion, unexpected large changes and surprises. That's a quote I pulled out of a report by an organization called Resources for the Future in Washington, D.C., which is funded by the Ford Foundation. And they do a lot of work on climate variability, and they argue that one of the greatest and most grave consequences is what we don't know can happen, that there may be a tipping point. Combination of environmental and development actions. The mitigation costs may be unprecedented. That's another reason these things are grand challenges. It could cost us trillions of dollars to redo the world's economy to respond to climate problems and other problems. And this is the one that I found very compelling as a political scientist. The likelihood of political conflict is high. Shifts in world food production, forest production, disputes over shared river basins. We're already seeing this worldwide. And we're going to see more of it. Could lead to conflicts over resource ownership control, responsibility for the mitigation of the impacts, and for compensating those who lose control of those benefits. So let's look at some examples and their policy implications. And I want to pick 3 issues that some argue are nearing a tipping point. They could permanently alter the planet and the welfare of future generations. And recall at the beginning I said one of the great challenges in environmental policy is this normative issue of making decisions that affect the future as well as other species. Climate change is one, species extinction is another, depletion of fresh water is a third. Now, here's the kicker, and this is what makes these things such a grand challenge. If these issues are really happening, they are not merely long-term problems that you could say, oh, well, you know what, let's defer them. Let's not worry about that depletion of the aquifer in Palestine and whether or not Israel and the Palestinians are going to fight over that water. Let's not worry about that. Who cares? You know, well, the Himalayan glaciers are melting. Let India and China worry about that in another 50 years, 100 years. No. You have to immediately attend to these issues now to avert a calamity that may not happen until 5 or 10 decades out. This generates great demands on science. What do we need to know before we can act? But I'm going to argue that it demands even more on policy, because we have to build a global political consensus. Remember I said at the beginning, one of the distinguishing characteristics of environmental policy is these issues do not respect political boundaries, the spatial and the temporal scope of environmental problems. This is tough. I'll take this any day, rather than sitting in a meeting with elected officials from around the world trying to come to a consensus on these issues. Very quickly, some of these things you already know about climate change. This is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the carbon flux in the environment. I only show you this figure, and you can look at it for your own reference and use it with other lectures you're learning about climate change. I use it simply to state that the key human influence on this flux is really limited to 2 things. What we do with fossil fuels and what we do with land use. And despite what you sometimes hear about, well, you know, if we could just plant more trees, we'd be doing great. We can't plant enough trees to offset this. So somehow or another, we got to find a way to address this, or we reach a tipping point. So when you look at the science, that's fixed. Policy-wise, how do we create a consensus around this? Because that's really where the problem is. It's creating a consensus on a remedy. CO2 emissions and concentration. Some of you have seen these sorts of figures before. This underscores the fact that there is a lag in the relationship between emissions and the actual concentrations over time, which again spells out the fact that to act on the problem means you have to do it earlier rather than later because there's a latent or a delayed effect. These are observed temperatures from a Met station network since the 1880s. And basically, when you take into account the seasonal variation in temperatures, there's definitely an upward trending, which seems to be pretty unambiguous. Some of you have seen this figure or ones like it. This, again, comes from the IPCC. I like using this one because it's a really policy-oriented way of demonstrating this concept of tipping points. What this one figure has tried to do, the IPCC in generating this, is saying there's lots of uncertainty over how much temperature change will occur relative to the period 1980 through 1999. By the way, 1980 is when IPCC was formed and started doing its research. Okay, so it could be 1 degree, 2 degrees, so on and so forth. But for each degree, we can extrapolate that on all of these resource areas, which are human systems, there will be worse and worse and worse impacts. So what this really says is that if you can't prevent the problem, at least what you'd like to do is arrest it at some point where it could become maybe more manageable. Okay? So this is what we're challenging building a consensus around. And these are geographic distribution of vulnerabilities. I won't spend much time with this other than to say what's interesting about these vulnerabilities when you take them from a figure and put them onto a spatial map, and this is, I'm going to come back to this in a little bit, the gravest impacts will be felt in the poorest countries, which also happen to be the countries that have the least political and economic capacity to adapt. So political consensus is needed for policy. You've heard about this. But finding a unified political will is going to be difficult due to economic and political uncertainties, energy prices, supply, population growth, equity concerns, on whom will the burdens of prevention and adaptation fall, national interest differences. OPEC countries that produce oil don't want to have hard and fast end to fossil fuel use, and no one will agree to greenhouse gas limits without some means of independently verifying them. Divergent levels of development will dictate cooperation. Less developed countries are going to demand assistance in meeting these problems. Energy efficiency will help somewhat, but it won't get us 100% there. It'll get us about 25% of the way. We still have to come up with new sources of energy. Less developed nations will require massive assistance. And prevention may be too late. There's already been some impacts that have been occurring. Whether or not we're at an irreversible tipping point, we don't know. But prevention is too late. Mitigation is too little. Adaptation is sort of in the realm that we're at. I want to show you a couple of figures that are generated by the International Energy Annual, which is a publication of the U.S. Department of Energy. And I want to spend a lot of time with these figures other than to underscore how they show the difficulty in obtaining a political consensus on environmental policy. If you look at the average annual growth in carbon dioxide emissions worldwide, what you're finding from the period 2005 and extrapolated out to 2030 is what? Developed countries like the United States, the OECD countries in Europe and Japan are actually going to be producing less greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis than are the rapidly developing economies of Mexico and South Korea. And if you look at the non-OECD economies, which are mostly Asian and Latin American countries, you see a still more rapid annual production of greenhouse gases than in other places. What does this figure tell you? What do these figures tell you? That developing countries are going to be responsible for the most rapid generation of greenhouse gases, certainly carbon dioxide emissions, from now into the foreseeable future. So in order to achieve a global consensus on what to do with this problem to avoid a tipping point, we somehow have to get them to buy into this. Some countries like Japan are actually reversing energy production, apparently. They're actually finding a way to produce enough renewably based energy that their contributions to the carbon flux are negative. It's quite amazing if it's true. But now let's complicate it just a little bit. That's a 25-year period. What if we look at per person responsibility for the problem? Little different story. Do you mean to tell me that OECD countries, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which are the 15 largest industrialized economies of the world, do you mean to tell me that they are fully 5 times more carbon dioxide per person than non-OECD countries? Yes, that's what this is saying. And historically, the United States produces about 5 times more carbon dioxide emissions per person than people in Mexico. So even though the rapidly industrializing economies of Asia and Latin America are producing more on an annual basis, on a per person basis, we are still consuming more energy and producing more of the problem than they are. So hard to get a political consensus when you think about that. Questions about that? Questions about that? When we go into negotiations at a place like Copenhagen, this is what we want to point to. When developing countries go into Copenhagen, this is what they want to point to. Species extinction. Say a little bit about this. Scientifically, there's a huge consensus, yes.
Oh, sorry, I want to just go back a slide.
Go ahead, we'll do that. Let's
Ask
go
you,
back.
do you think consensus, it's going to take political conflicts before you start seeing more consensus on these issues globally? I guess I'm asking for projection, but...
Yeah, that's a good question. And I see that right now potentially going one of 2 ways. One is it could produce more consensus, but it's equally likely that it could produce more intractable conflict. Because if you get to the point where the conflict actually, or where a crisis actually erupts, then people start choosing up winners and losers. Who do they want to be with? And so I could see it working either way. I think a better solution, I'll come back to this at the end, but I think a better solution would be to figure out a way that we could go into an agreement aimed at consensus that would actually reduce our contributions to the problem before demanding that less developed countries reduce their contribution to the problem. Show that we have a genuine commitment to really reconverting our economy in a big way. Right now, that doesn't seem very likely, but I think that's what it will take. So species extinction. Scientifically, great consensus. The implications, if as massive as predicted, would impair the environment's ability to recover from natural and human-made disaster. It could destroy natural systems that purify the world's air and water. Reduce the potential for discovery of new health solutions. Degradation of the world's economy. Weaken social and political stability of nations across the globe. These are all things that we're only now starting to factor into debates over global environmental policy. This was a report that came out exactly 2 years ago from University of California, Santa Barbara, which houses the National Center for Biodiversity. And pretty frightening that we're now on a precipice of mass extinctions of flora and fauna. We're now at a tipping point, the authors of this study at Santa Barbara are arguing. And we're now kind of at a lifeboat approach. Which species can we save? Which species are still salvageable? Very frightening policy challenge. Let me end with water depletion. It's an area that I have special interest in, but it's one that I think ties into the species extinction issue, and it also certainly ties into the climate change issue. There is an argument that the diversion of water from streams, rivers, and groundwater sources will deplete in-stream flow beyond recoverable levels. Some say this is already happening in places like the Colorado River here in the Southwest. Deplete aquifers beyond their ability to be recharged. We call this water mining. This has been happening in parts of southern Arizona. It's happening in parts of the Central Valley, California. Changes to hydrology would not only harm species and irreversibly alter riparian environments, but it would degrade water quality and quantity, irreversibly reduce water tables and available supplies, has the potential for population dislocations and food supply dislocations. And I think equally important, and this gets to your question about conflicts, it would generate huge social inequities. The diversion of water from poor to wealthier areas. We've already done this in the United States. Historically, we have diverted water from areas where people were powerless and poor, channeled the water to areas where people were wealthy. We're going to see more of this, and we're going to see it on a worldwide scale. Some of you are familiar with the lower Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley. This is in Kern County, parts of Kern County and other counties to the north. The darker shaded areas are areas where there has been dramatic subsidence of land as a result of the mining of groundwater. That's a map view. Here's a photographic view. This is an amazing picture taken not far from Bakersfield. This is a telephone pole that shows in 1925 where the surface of this particular land was and where it ended up being 52 years later in 1977. This is a dramatic subsidence of land. This is an irreversible problem. You can't repump the aquifer and push the land back up. And how is the Central Valley compensated for this? Well, we now have state laws that prevent any further groundwater overdrafting. Now we simply have to divert surface water from the delta into the Central Valley. That is, as long as the Endangered Species Act enforcement allows us to do so, and it's not. We've had to cut back water deliveries. And have there been irreversible social impacts? 25% unemployment, parts of the Central Valley, whole transitionings away from an agribusiness industry to something else, something still to be determined. Water pollution. Irreversible damage to surface water quality. How many of you remember this incident that happened only a month ago? Kolentar, Hungary. This was a toxic sludge spill, a tailing dam that held wastes in a tributary of the Danube. Burst, and all of these wastes, including arsenic and mercury from this aluminum processing plant, 184 million gallons of alkaline red mud covered this community of Kolentar, Hungary. Now eventually, that water will drain or be absorbed by the soil, and it'll just be left with a red covering. Is this irreversible damage? What do you think? Stay tuned. We don't know. What we do know is that countries like Hungary probably do not have the capacity economically or politically to do much about this damage that's already been imposed. But this, I think, says that these threats, irreversible threats to water and water supply and quality, are still very, very much with us. Will continue to be. A little closer to home, Mono Lake. This is what happens when you divert Owens Valley water to Los Angeles. You create an alkali lake bed, which in dust storms creates air pollution. So, summing up, where are we? Well, I think we're at a point where we need to think about reconciling the science of environmental problems with environmental policy. Science raises questions about what we need to know before we can act, or what we think we know, and tries to help us determine what we don't know, grappling with the problems of uncertainty and risk. And we started out talking about these problems of measurement, calibration in environmental policy, and how science feeds into policy. The questions are, can we build a policy consensus along these grand challenges? And my suggestions, based on what we know about environmental policy, are the following things. Whatever we come up with, the solutions have to be agreeable to every country, regardless of its level of development. That's a very high bar to reach. It's the only way you're going to get agreement on climate. It's the only way you're going to get agreement on water. It's the only way you're going to get agreement on protecting endangered species and other grand challenges. The solutions have to be agreeable, which means that you're going to have to implement them in different ways, benefiting different social needs in different countries. The solutions have to meet a test of confidence building, and confidence building means that every country has to believe that whatever it is they're doing to comply, every other country is doing as well. If we're the only ones reducing our emissions, not overdrafting groundwater, not threatening endangered species, while other countries are being a free rider and living off our goodwill, then we're not going to comply with these agreements. That's what we mean by confidence building. And getting back to the ethical dimensions of environmental policy, the decisions have to be fair not only to people but to nature. And they have to be fair not only to people living today, but they have to be fair to future generations. Or, come the future, those generations will reject our solutions, or else be burdened by having to live with them. So, it's kind of a way of looking at some of the challenges of environmental policy. I know this is kind of an overwhelming summary, but to kind of give you an idea how these things hopefully connect up. Questions? These are some of the challenges, I think, on a small scale you're going to be working with on your project as well, very definitely. Anything at all?